Hello and welcome to this edition of The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Shanghai, China. Now, the European Union has decided to levy countervailing duties against Chinese-made electric vehicles. This coincided with the United States stepping up its technological containment vis-à-vis China. What is the future of China-European relations? Will Europe follow in footstep with the United States, not just in terms of security, but economically as well? Now, our conversation today is with Mr. Danilo Türk, the former president of Slovenia. President Türk, we're here in Shanghai, the beautiful Bund, for the ESG conference. We'll have to start with something more relevant and more somber. The European Union's decision to levy tariffs, countervailing tariffs, on Chinese electric vehicles. Of course, we as Chinese feel that is unfair given the capacity of us to produce and the undercapacity of some. How do you look at all this? Why did the European Union come to this conclusion, regardless of economists' opposition? Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think that the European Union was caught by surprise. They didn't expect such a rapid and high-quality development of production of electric vehicles in China. Of course, the production was in the process for some time now, but the effects are rather dramatic. The quality of vehicles, the availability of vehicles, the affordability of vehicles has been such that European manufacturers were all surprised, and European institutions are taking the kind of automatic response that is, higher tariffs. That's not a good approach. I am very doubtful about this approach by European Union. I think European Union is sometimes taking too much of a protectionist stance, and that is not going to be particularly helpful either to European Union or any of European Union's partners. So in European Union, we really need a further discussion on, all right, how do we want to work with China? Because China has become so important and so effective in many ways that we have to define our cooperative arrangements in an adequate way. It makes no sense to accumulate non-tariff barriers, to accumulate other things. We have to figure out how to bring European Union and China closely into a comprehensive process of improvement.
What do you think is behind the European Union's decision? I mean, in America, where I used to work for 8 years as a correspondent, the power of the lobbyists against the 400-strong members of Congress is very strong. In the European Union, according to your best analysis, what do you think is behind?
There are several factors. One of them is obviously the lobby of European automobile industries, who feel threatened, who feel that this competition can be rather serious, which is not an entirely new phenomenon. I remember the time when the Japanese vehicles started to enter European Union. It was also a lot of panic at that time. So a panicky reaction to a new major player in the production of automobiles is certainly one factor. But it's not the only one. I think European Union is still in the process of trying to figure out how to deal with China, if I may put it this way. See, European Union has defined China as a partner, as a competitor, and as a systemic rival. I must say that I don't like the idea of systemic rival, because, of course, we cooperate, we compete. Competition and cooperation are two sides of the same coin. And European Union has to be prepared for both cooperation and competition. But systemic rivalry is a problem, because I think we should be wise enough to build a common system, a system which is globally beneficial to all. If you say systemic rival, that sounds a little bit like I have to block that other in order to be dominant. Now, I'm sufficiently familiar with politics that I know that politics is about power, clearly, and we have to be realistic about that. But politics is also about charting the future, and future can be developed together. And I believe that that is a deficit in European policy making right now. I am not sure to what extent China is thinking about European Union as a genuine partner, beyond competition, beyond systemic rivalry. Of course, systemic rivalry is not a terminology used in China, but it is something that apparently has an impact, and one would have to have a serious discussion about that.
And in your opinion, policy making or politicking is inevitable, but policy making is also about making sure we move in the right direction. And do you think that by partnering with China, economically at least, that's the best approach for the Europeans?
For me, yes. No, one has to understand that European Union is not a coherent system. European Union consists of a number of member states, and member states are different. And there are different political forces in charge of different member states of European Union. Some of them are really very open-minded and would like to develop a kind of a synergy between China and European Union. Others are more conservative. Some are fearing that China may actually harm the prosperity of Europe by, taking advantage of its production capacity, innovative spirit, dynamism, and so forth. So one has to understand the complexity of European Union also. There are countries which are really very advanced, there are countries which are very open-minded, but there are also countries which are worried.
And you talk about the fact that the European Union navigated through its initial animosity towards, or bitterness towards Japan and the Japanese car-making industry when Japan exported over 50% of its entire manufactured cars. How do you think that episode can perhaps inform and enlighten today's European approach vis-a-vis China?
This is a very good question, and I don't have an answer. I do have, however, a wish. I would like people to study the experience of Japan. See, I would like them to study the whole experience, which moved from fear and panic into a much more cooperative system. I'm sure that the Chinese vehicles will be very popular because they are comfortable, they are easy to maintain, and they are, at least that's what I have seen in China when I visit. These are the kind of cars which are very good for families, which are very good for various activities beyond actual work. So they have advantages. I'm sure that over the years this will be sorted out. I'm an optimist by nature. But I'm old enough to remember how skeptical people were about Japanese cars when they first arrived to European markets. One has to learn from past experience, and one has to learn fast because things are changing.
Do you think it was easier for Japan than it would have been for China, considering the fact that Japan was a staunch ally of the United States, so was NATO, which incorporates much of the European Union, or the other way around? And then in this case of China, it is obviously a target of the United States of a strategy of containment and suppression.
Well, look, I mean, this may be a factor, but it is not a decisive factor. This is not really so important. Of course, everything is happening in a political atmosphere, in a climate which is not good, which could be better. But I don't think that the difference is so dramatic. The lack of trust which we experienced vis-a-vis the Japanese cars many years ago was in fact relatively similar to what is felt vis-a-vis the Chinese vehicles nowadays. Although, of course, China is moving much more rapidly. China was a major market for European automobiles for years now. And now, at sudden, it becomes a major supplier. And that's difficult to manage. So I think that there are certain basic differences here between the current China experience and the previous Japan experience for Europe. But I would like that the Japan experience is taken as which should inform us on how to live in a globalized world. We don't have to produce all the cars in Europe. We don't have to do that. But of course, we have to move beyond the current state of play. That's not easy. And European Union is a complex system. Also, political differences within European Union play a role. So it will require patience, persistence, hard work.
President Türk, how do you envision, or should I say, what kind of security relations do you expect to see between China and the European Union? considering the geopolitical environment, the war in Europe, in the Middle East, and the rivalry between China and the United States that is being ever intensifying?
Yeah. In the short run, I think we are likely to have some difficulties because European Union and Europe generally, they are not well prepared for changes. And this whole process of internalizing the need for change will take time. I don't think that we can hope for a swift transition or a swift understanding of the new needs. I think that the future of the security in the world is only global. I don't think that we can, rely on military alliances only. We have to figure out a global system. And that is not going to be easy, especially since Europe is now so influenced by the war in Ukraine. We would need to find a better way of managing things through collective security.
Mr. President, do you think that the underlying logic of world affairs that is governed pretty much by the United States, who thinks itself as a benign hegemony, and where realism is really the rule of the day, whereby it believes that eventually nations will be vying for their own best interests, and therefore you've got to have deterrence, you've got to have force so strong that peace through strength, so-called by Trump. Do you think that underlying theory has, in fact, brought us more destruction, especially in the 21st century, than it would have been had other schools of thought prevailed?
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, this has been a very unfortunate development. And I think that the notion of a benign hegemon is not realistic, because hegemons always impose their views on others. That's the essence of hegemonic rule, and that cannot be benign. I think that benign hegemon concept is actually quite harmful, and one would need to look for, and as an alternative, towards a concept of collective security, a collective security which is open to all. It should be inclusive, collective security with a responsible core. It's a responsible core. Now, of course, that responsible core means current 5 members of the UN Security Council who have to come back to their capacity, ability to work in concert. We had such a situation recently when it was possible for a short period in history, in the 1990s, to work as a collective core. And then, of course, the overall system of collective security can function better. The Secretary General of the United Nations of that time, Boutros Ghali, was asked in 1991 to write an agenda for peace. And that request was made unanimously by all members of the Security Council, including all permanent members of the Security Council. So the Secretary General of the United Nations produced a blueprint. And that blueprint needed to be finalized, to be worked out in detail, which did not happen because complications that have taken place subsequently have actually led the major powers to go in different directions. So right now, I think there is no inevitability in the tendency to move towards a kind of a bloc divisions. This is not inevitable. But of course, it's difficult to overcome that because the political leaders will be bound by their constituencies, their ideas, by their think tanks, by their opinion makers, influential actors of different kinds, and that makes it more difficult, sometimes perhaps even impossible, to come to a cooperative model for the future.
Sometimes reality kicks in. Why do you think the Americans are so intent on beating down on a close rival, a close number 2?
America is place where competition has strong roots. I mean, they are, they like to compete. And then on top of that, they have been and continue to be the leading power of the world. And that certainly creates a mindset. That creates a mindset even by those who would logically be more open-minded to cooperative patterns. The mindset is clearly very self-centered, quite hegemonistic, and that it's not going to be easy to change. But look, the important thing is that change is peaceful. That's the only important thing. Because human beings can manage everything as long as they remain peaceful, as long as they don't choose military means to, manage their differences. So I hope that this peaceful attitude, which we still enjoy, will continue to prevail, and that search will happen within such a peaceful framework. But sometimes one has the feeling that this clash of civilizations thought actually guides some of our American friends in their policy making. And that's not good. I think one would need to go back to say, all right, clash of civilization is a danger which we want to avoid. How to avoid that? Well, by better management and better cooperation. Some institutions which are designed to improve cooperation should be reformed, including the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, which are becoming more and more central. The United Nations Security Council should be strengthened. That may mean perhaps a few new members and some other changes. So the international institutions can be improved, clearly, but that is not going to be enough. I mean, what we need is really a political maturity of decision makers in the most powerful countries. If we have that, I think that problems that we now see can be managed and can be resolved. But of course, we do not know whether such capacity exists.
I really appreciate your characterization advocating for political maturity, because to borrow the word of Francis Fukuyama, the current US system is hijacked by constitutional rigidity instead of political maturity.
Yes, and of course that's the how should I say, the challenge of pluralistic politics which is based on plurality of political parties. They compete, and sometimes their competition is rewarded when more extreme positions are advanced, and that's an inbuilt danger, inbuilt in the system. And of course, that requires very wise leadership to figure out, all right, we certainly compete and we would like to be more powerful than the other, but we also have to be responsible because we are a great power. We are the greatest power of our era, and we have to be responsible in these sort of things, not allowing competition for and struggle for power to take over every issue. There must be a consensus about certain basic issues which are important for survival. And one of them is to make sure that the competition between the United States and China remains within reasonable framework. There will have to be competition, clearly, but there will have to be cooperation also. And the kind of conceptual framework for that, which could actually provide the necessary basis for both competition and cooperation, that's the main strategic task.
Talking about China, President Türk, you've written extensively, you've studied extensively about China, you've written books about China, visiting the country, dozens of times so far?
Well, like 40 times, but I haven't written very much about China. I still have to be very humble. You know, China is an old civilization, a great country, and one should be careful before one says, okay, I really know China.
What message do you want to convey to the China watchers outside China who may not speak the language, may not get their information and narratives from Chinese language sources, who rely mostly on Anglo-Saxon media sources, who have a certain stereotype and point of view towards China, which may be a far cry from the reality happening on the ground? What kind of a country do you feel China is, and what about the merit of its leaders, thought leadership, proposing peace, security, civilization, in harmony, in sync, a collective future, so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, if you say shared future, this sounds like an invitation. All right, come, let's talk about future. We want to have good future. We are not necessarily against your good future. We have to make sure that future is good for everybody. So if you talk about destiny, that might sound like, well, no, we are destined to go in a direction which we do not control, and which may actually end very badly for both of us or all of us. So I think that this choice of concepts is really very important nowadays. And I think that political leaders should really use their imagination to figure out what kind of practice and what kind of principles they want to put in place to make sure that this idea of shared future, for example, becomes really the guiding idea of our time. I think it's a very good idea which we should be strengthening. It's not entirely new either. I mean, the United Nations was based on the idea of a shared future. That is why we come together in a big inclusive organization. And again, that idea came from the United States. It was the United States of America which really pushed for both League of Nations and subsequently the United Nations, because they believed in this idea of shared future. Now, China is expressing the idea of shared future in its own way, but it is basically very close to this same idea. Now, of course, great ideas are important because they then define further thinking and also further activity, further action. So I would like the thought of common future to be given really proper attention and imagination to figure out what it all entails on all fields. One of them is security that we discussed, but also trade, World Trade Organization, and there are many other aspects of it. That is what I think is absolutely fundamental. And the second thing is intensity of communication. There have to be visits, there have to be meetings, people have to talk, people have to engage in real discussion. You can't rely only on what you will find in this or other journal. You have to open the space and the opportunities for many people to talk. That's my second point. This is what we need. This is what we need, and this is what we do not have in a sufficient measure, I would say. It's very often we, meaning political class, is satisfied with cliches, with kind of a simplified formula, and of course that doesn't lead us very far.
What kind of a power do you feel that the Global South is shaping up to be, and also how are they, if they were becoming a power to be reckoned with, shaping global norms and governance?
Well, look, I belong to a generation which witnessed the creation of another concept some 40, 50 years ago called the New International Economic Order. That was built in 1970s. The main conferences were in 1973, 4, 5, 6, mid-1970s. It's half a century ago. New International Economic Order. And that was a concept that was developed by the Global South. It was very legalistic. Principles, rules, norms, institutions, these sort of things. And that, of course, looked at that time as a possible way forward. Now, it didn't happen that way because the developed world, the global West, so to speak, offered another option based on the idea of free market, based on the idea of trade negotiations, which, of course, give a big advantage to more powerful players. And of course, the whole financial system, which works in perpetuating the power structure that existed before the 1970s. So the idea of new international economic order as largely a legalistic concept could not succeed. What we see now is different. It's very different. Now we see mobilization of BRICS, which is an interesting group of countries. We see a leading role of Brazil. which is an important factor in this. We see a completely new power structure enabled by China, because China has risen. China is a major player which has demonstrated its critical role in the latest financial crisis some 10 years ago or so. And it's obvious that this is a new power dynamic that is taking place, which can work to the benefit of the global south. That new power dynamic, which is created by some major players, like in particular China, but also Brazil, Russia, and others, their intention or their effort to offer new ways of approaching these issues, new ways of discussing and managing discussion on these issues. We'll see what comes as a result. We don't have a good sense of that as yet. But then again, I think one of the issues that will have to be put on the agenda is, how do you want to use the United Nations for the purpose? Because United Nations remains the only inclusive institutional network. And it is already very well developed. It would be very good if all these movements that we see could find their final act in a strategy accepted by the United Nations, genuinely accepted by everybody, including the West, of course. That would be my hope and my vision. That's an objective, that's a direction worth fighting for. And I hope we will move in that direction.
And that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Shanghai. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you again next time.